So as promised, tonight we're talking about a recent event held by the Club of Rome. The Club of Rome and the Council for the Human Future, as they deem themselves, held their event on August 1st. They outlined a pathway towards one world government. One of their next steps is to rewrite the UN Charter, claiming they want to articulate the rules of a world parliament for world citizens. During this event, the groups called for action to address the so-called polycrisis of doom, a term coined by guys like Henry Kissinger and George Soros. These individual crises include climate change, overpopulation, new pandemics, misinformation, financial collapse, and nuclear war. Yes, they have proclaimed from their ivory tower that, and I quote, all human life could be extinguished in the next 50 years. But ironically, to save humanity from extinction, their solutions include reducing the human population, to create a global truth commission, and to establish a one-world currency. However, before we get into the gritty details, I want to discuss some of the philosophical aspects. You know, there's a fine line between utopia and dystopia. A utopian system, when established by men, is likely to be synonymous with a dystopian depression, as the only way for perfect peace is absolute control of all wrongs. Now we are seeing this faulty thinking run rampant within our political system, especially on the global stage. Global leaders have seemingly taken this to heart, as they want to control everything. Every Western nation has fallen victim not only to this lure of power, but also a belief that with applying pressure to the populace, they can cleverly mold the human race into something new, something quote-unquote perfect, despite the fact our true beauty as conscious beings revolves around our imperfections. However, for some reason, they seem to believe they can control not only our impulses and our behavior, but even our thought process. And they feel as if they have the moral imperative to do so. This is where we fall back into an old question. Are the powers that be stupid, as in lacking foresight? Or does it originate with evil intent? It's a question that keeps coming back, as their solutions to these societal issues, in every sense, represent an inverted reality. Their solutions often exacerbate and make matters worse for everybody. Yes, they create the chaos they so ardently claim to be fighting against. I often argue that it's intentional. As we talked about in the last video, I believe it represents an element of the chaos plan. Create the problem, exploit the problem, and then offer the solution. And the solution is always the goal. The rest is just the way to get there. Now, if you happen to buy what they are selling, then you believe in this future utopian society. It's all seemingly a part of this grand idea. However, we see the darker implications of this play out day after day, as they cannot arrive at their destination through honest means. So, as a result, they dole out arbitrary punishments, they lie, manipulate, propagandize, and seek to indoctrinate the masses into an illusion. Well, perhaps I should say, into their delusion. It happens on every level. One example is weaponized tribalism. It's just one method, but equally as nefarious as everything else. With each and every mistake, small or big, another person is shamed into nothingness and mindlessly shut down by the herd. Using our very nature as a weapon of conformity. They claim it's a part of evolutionary biology, as your survival used to be directly tied to the group. Being an outsider used to be a death sentence. As in, you can't stay with us anymore, and then, well, you were eaten by wolves in the night. However, they use that evolutionary quirk against us today. The collective, the hive mind, the need to belong. No matter which way you look at it though, the result is a superficial peace made by force or by fear. One in which there's not even freedom to breathe. And it's a false choice. They try to force you to choose between freedom or security, as if they are mutually exclusive. And they aren't. The conversation is everyone starting from a falsehood, and that is how you get got. The problem lies within our perception, but the truth is, humanity's ultimate utopia could be its ultimate regret, as the controls put in place to build it stifle the very nature of our being. But without further ado, let's talk about their fabled vision for the future. First, we're going to need some background. As you know, I like to lay out the timeline just as a way to get a better understanding of how we got here. Although, just you wait, all of this is insane. Calling this agenda crazy is an understatement. Now, the timeline. So if you don't know, the Club of Rome came out with the limits to growth in 1972, I believe, and it revolved around overpopulation in relation to resource scarcity. In that paper, they claimed that society would collapse by 2030 unless these problems were addressed. Now, as you're going to hear in a few minutes, one of their so-called solutions is what the Club of Rome deems voluntary population reduction. It's a main tenet of their Agenda 2030 initiative. And so, in order to do this, they planted a seed within the public consciousness. They called the movement Zero Population Growth.
We had formed an organization called Zero Population Growth, and then Johnny took me on The Tonight Show.
Would you welcome Dr. Paul Ehrlich? You have to get the death rate and birth rate in balance, and there's only two ways to do it. One is to bring the birth rate down, the other is to push the death rate up.
I did the show maybe 20 times, and we went from 6 chapters and 600 members to 600 chapters and 60,000 members.
We're starting in now. This is the first step.
The Bagleys belong to a growing number of young marrieds who favor ZPG, zero population growth.
How many children do you have?
2. I have 2 children.
Ehrlich's views on how to bring the birth rate down were concrete. Compulsion if voluntary methods fail, creating a blacklist of people, companies, and organizations impeding population control in the U.S., responsibility prizes for childless marriages, a tax on children, and a luxury tax on diapers and cribs.
The concerns about population became misanthropic. And it was taken with so much seriousness that Paul Ehrlich could recommend things like putting stuff in public water that would make people not as fertile.
Panic is not too strong a word to use for some of the advocates that I referred to as true believers.
It was a zeitgeist that was taking shape.
Attention, all citizens. Childbearing is herewith forbidden.
One of the things about zeitgeists is they have astonishing durability.
It appears that large families are on the way out, and ZPG may be possible.
Yeah, the PSYOP started a long time ago, and we are just beginning to feel the consequences of it now. The consequences are a future that could be defined by population collapse and widespread automation to make up for it, which is exactly what they want for the so-called Fourth Industrial Revolution. So, in the early 1970s, we had the limits to growth and the zero population growth movement. And yeah, they both entered the zeitgeist. Well, in 1991, the Club of Rome released a sequel entitled The First Global Revolution. On page 115, they describe their plan to unite humanity with a common enemy. That common enemy is humanity itself, and the ploy is climate messaging. And I quote, "In searching for a new enemy to unite us, we came up with the idea that pollution, the threat of global warming, water shortages, famine, and the like would fit the bill. All of these dangers are caused by human intervention, and it's only through changed attitudes and behavior that they can be overcome. The real enemy, then, is humanity itself." End of quote. And yeah, you're starting to see the vision? That came out in 1991.
At some point down the line, the narrative changed to be around climate. What was the narrative prior to that? What was the justification they were giving in order to push, this kind of more control from the top down?
Yeah, immediately preceding climate and environment, actually the Cold War was the pretext for having this incredibly large, incredibly powerful federal government. In fact, you see a very clear break when the Club of Rome met in 1991 as the Soviet state and the Eastern European communist states were collapsing. The Club of Rome, very, very powerful elitists. Obviously, Mikhail Gorbachev was there. You had many prominent Americans, people like Al Gore. They got together and they came up with this incredible document where they actually said we need a new justification for this all-powerful state. So the new excuse is going to be because the environment is going to be harmed and because climate is going to hurt us.
Wait, what? I could not believe what I just heard. Did world leaders really lay out this globalist plan in plain English in a physical book way back in 1991? I went on Amazon, and there it was, The First Global Revolution, which states, and I quote, "In searching for a common enemy to unite us, we came up with the idea that pollution, the threat of global warming, water shortages, famine, and the like would fit the bill. And therefore, the real enemy is humanity itself."
The science is clear. We are getting dangerously close to the point of no return.
The science is very clear. This natural world is severely endangered.
Code Red for Humanity is not a group of political officials, elected officials. These are the scientists.
There is a top-down quality to this policy which is extremely forceful, and the forcefulness comes from scientism, which is the ideology that we understand the world fully because of science. We have to listen to the science so that we have a better future for tomorrow. This is just ideological BS, and it's also quite dangerous. It's a dangerous way of looking at the world because then it means nothing matters apart from science. Culture doesn't matter, history doesn't matter, religion doesn't matter, social interaction doesn't matter, nothing matters but science. You don't need to be a theologian or philosopher to understand that that's complete nonsense, but also dangerous nonsense.
So, those two books, The Limits to Growth and The First Global Revolution, led to Agenda 21, which in 1992, Nancy Pelosi signed us onto at the Earth Summit in Rio.
The Earth Summit Environmental Leadership Act, as this is known, presents us with an opportunity to follow up on the important work of the Earth Summit to develop its blueprint, Agenda 21, for global environmental action. HCON Res 353 outlines a comprehensive national strategy for sustainable development in accordance with the principles of Agenda 21 to be coordinated under the leadership of a specific office and at the direction of a high-level government official. The resolution also urges the United States to identify and initiate further agreements to protect the global environment and to support the creation of a high-level United Nations Sustainable Development Commission headed by an Undersecretary General.
And all of that transition into what we now know as Agenda 2030. Always keep in mind, they like to use circular tactics. Hit the people from all sides. I mean, isn't it interesting that the solutions put forth to address mass immigration, rise in crime, and climate change are all the same? The solutions are always the same, and they always have the same timeline. Specifically, you'll see that 2030 date all over. When predictions for calamity are on the same timeline as economic proposals, well, that should be a clue that something's off. Now, to me, the climate change angle is particularly funny. Not in a ha-ha type of way. I mean, they want to reduce the human population by 75%, so yeah, not really funny. But with climate change, really, what I believe on that subject or what you believe makes no difference. Let's just say, hypothetically, that you believe it's going to destroy the world. Well then, mass surveillance, carbon taxes, CBDC, facial recognition, social credit scores, and a truth commission. Yeah, that's going to change the weather. That's going to change climate patterns and save you. Sure thing. Believe whatever you want, I guess. Actually don't, because we're going to be in a dystopian hellscape if you fall for it. So, try to use some logic and reason, okay? Anyway, the Club of Rome is still up to their old tricks. Let's head over to Tim Hinchliffe, who helped gather the videos for people on social media. A link to his thread and articles will be in the comments. Now, this video is pretty quick. It's about 1.5 minutes, but it's sort of like a highlight reel. And then after, we'll go through each point, but really pay attention to number 8.
An end to the use of fossil fuels to stem both climate change and global poisoning. A circular world economy that wastes nothing and reuses everything. Renewable food for everyone to sustain all humanity and reduce the threat of war. A Stewards of the Earth plan for rewilding half the Earth, run by farmers and indigenous people. A Clean Up the Earth plan, including a new human right not to be poisoned. A World Population Plan, providing voluntary family planning for all. A World Pandemic Plan, to prevent and arrest the uncontrolled spread of disease caused by human behaviour. A Global Technology Convention, to oversee all the powerful new technologies before they are put to dangerous misuse. A World Truth Commission, to expose the liars and their lies to public shame. And an Earth System Currency, to try to correct the rape of our planet by an infinite supply of otherwise totally imaginary money. There are many other actions that must be taken to mitigate the dangers in which humans now stand, and most of them are explained in How to Fix a Broken Planet. At the heart of this, as I said, is an Earth System Treaty, a legal compact by which the world's people, not just its governments, but everyone, that includes you and me, which commits all of those who sign it to work for a habitable Earth and a safer human future.
Yeah, did you notice number 8? Really glossed over the mass murder on that one, but we'll get there. Let's start with the first quote-unquote solution, ending fossil fuels. What a great idea. Let's plunge the world into the dark ages and ensure every living human is reduced to squalor and poverty. Let alone the fact that this radical plan would result in millions upon millions dead. I believe this would really impact third world countries and, to be honest, the entire continent of Africa. Estimates vary from tens of millions to hundreds of millions, and yes, some have predicted billions would die as a result. And if that's the case, then the powers that be will be able to scoop up all those natural resources for the green agenda with limited pushback, because most people would be dead, and that does not seem like too bad of a deal for them. Do you remember that chart I showed you a couple weeks ago? They have the net zero timeline laid out with every sector of business and governance. A really telling part is the aviation and shipping industry. Between 2030 and 2049, all airports are closed. All shipping declines to zero. Absolute zero starts in 2050. No commercial flying, no travel, no more global shipping. And just so you know, everything comes to a standstill at that point. And I quote, "If fossil fuels were banned, modern civilization would crumble in a matter of days, and some believe even billions of people would die within months, either from starvation or freezing. The life you live and the luxuries enabled by fossil fuels, gone." In fact, a research paper was released back in April. There would be disastrous consequences for the poor, people worldwide, future generations, and the West. If fossil fuels and CO2 emissions are reduced to zero, well, you're gonna get mass starvation, end of quote. So, there you go. I could not agree more. Supporters of this net zero plan claim that's why it's called a transition. They propose a soft landing in 2050, which is quite naive and moronic. Look at the current rate. We do not have the necessary technology to replace current energy production. That's why they're pushing for economic degrowth, because they know it cannot be replaced. I mean, we don't even have the power grid to enable it, regardless of anything else. We'd have to rebuild and reinforce the entire grid first, and guess what? That's not happening. The result is going to be widespread blackouts, and then all the negative aspects I talked about so far are going to come to fruition. A great example is what happened in California. Remember when they announced everyone has to switch to electric vehicles, and then, right after, told everyone to avoid charging their cars because the power grid could not handle it? Yeah, come on, extrapolate that to the entire nation. The bottom line, we are not ready. We aren't even close to being ready, and they know this. They simply want less people, and that's exactly what they're going to get with this so-called transition. Anyway, up next they have the circular economy. Yeah, this one. You know, son of a bitch. The circular economy, otherwise known as the service economy, basically it's all about renting and ending ownership as a concept. Do you happen to remember Ida Auken of the World Economic Forum? She wrote that infamous article, and I quote, "Welcome to 2030. I own nothing, have no privacy, and life has never been better." End of quote. Yeah. I don't believe it, Ida. I don't believe you at all.
Third thing I will point to is a very big move that's happening at the moment from product to service. I have a friend, he says every product is a service waiting to happen. If you think about it, I mean, your cell phone, why do you want to own your cell phone? How many of you own your cell phones? How many knows if the company owns it? It's actually not a lot. I mean, you want the function, you want the service, right? Why do you want to own a cell phone if you can just lease it? And if you lease, why shouldn't you lease your refrigerator or your washing machine or your dishwasher, or why do you want to own it?
We're going to come back to this end of private ownership with a different aspect of their agenda, because, as I said earlier, they have multiple attack points and multiple fail-safes built in. But up next, we have the subversion of the food system, or as they call it, climate-proof food. I can't even say that right. Or as they call it, climate-proof food. Yeah, Monsanto's definitely getting a bump in their stock, that's for sure. This is going to come in the form of bug protein, as we have been seeing more and more. In fact, the UK government, on top of thought crimes, just announced a new initiative to get their entire country to eat crickets. So there you go. But it's also going to come in the form of lab-grown meat. Overall, it's a simple concept. Control the food, control the people, and as a bonus, they can also poison you. So, yeah.
Somebody from the UN Food and Agriculture Organization sent me this report. This came out in 2013. Nobody ever reads these things, but he said, this is important. You have to read this. So I read it and ended up writing an article about it. It was published in May of 2016. UN let them eat bugs. Kind of the Marie Antoinette. I don't know that she really said that. A lot of people say she didn't. But the report was about how they're going to make us eat bugs. How meat and chicken and traditional agriculture were not sustainable. And the food of the future was going to have to be creepy crawlers. And they actually have a big section in the report about, you know, those Westerners, they're pretty picky with their food. They're not really going to want to eat bugs. We're going to have a major propaganda campaign. We'll use state-funded media, and we'll use government indoctrination centers masquerading as schools to get them used to the idea of eating bugs. And so I reported all this over 10 years ago. And then along comes Joe Biden.
With regard to food shortages, yes, we did talk about food shortages. and it's going to be real.
It's going to be real, right? So, a lot of people think, I'm not going to eat bugs. That's crazy, right? And Klaus Schwab in the World Economic Forum, in their little video, they said by 2030, you're going to have to eat a lot less meat to save the planet. So how are they going to get people to eat bugs? Well, a combination of propaganda, indoctrinating children, and making you very, very hungry. And what you'll find as you look at these policies is every single one of the national and state and local policies traces directly back to various UN and World Economic Forum programs like Agenda 2030. Agenda 2030 was signed by every national government in the world in 2015. On behalf of the United States, Barack Obama called it an executive agreement. And it's a plan to totally transform every element of our lives. In fact, the head of the UN General Assembly at the time called it the master plan for humanity. And if you read the preface, it says over and over again, no one will be left behind. And so a big part of this, as you read it, and I tie all the points back to that, is you got to transform agriculture, you got to transform the food supply, you got to transform every element of life. And so in keeping with that UN report on using government propaganda, here's the World Economic Forum promoting insect farming. Right? As we speak, they're actually building the largest insect protein manufacturing facility in the world in Decatur, Illinois. So the World Economic Forum thinks you need to eat the bugs. And here is the government-funded propaganda outlet known as PBS.
The future of food is being revolutionized by science, as new research helps bring unexpected ingredients to the table.
Kind of tastes like shrimp. They have this seafood quality to them.
It reminds you of like a Frito or a chip.
Yes. Just Frito or a chip, okay? So it's crazy talk, right? And so this actually comes from my home state of Florida. Everybody thinks our government schools in Florida are great. They're not. But this was sent to me by the parent of a concerned fifth grader. She was told that she had to do these workshops, and bugs are the food of the future. And she said, actually in the class, they told the kids that eating meat is bad for the planet. Your parents are bad for wanting to eat steak all the time. They say, here's the list of how much CO2 emissions, right? Crickets, you get 0.47 kilos of crickets per ounces of CO2, whatever. And you see that apparently bugs are really, really sustainable. The government knows quite a bit about eating bugs. Turns out it's very, very unhealthy. I pulled these right out of the National Library of Medicine 2017 study funded by the government. Said that the chitin in bugs, the exoskeletons, will provoke human innate immunity to generate a deluge of inflammatory cytokines which injure organs and, in persistent situations, lead to death, multiple sclerosis, systemic lupus, and cancer. Sign me up, right? So the goal, folks, is not to save the planet. It's not to save the climate. Like the revolutionaries used to say back in the 60s, the Students for a Democratic Society, the issue is never the issue. It's not about global warming. It's not about sustainable development. It's about enslaving humanity. They want to wipe out small, medium-sized producers, centralize food control in the hands of mega corporations in bed with the mega governments. They want to move the population into the mega cities and ultimately bring about this great reset in what they call the New World Order. And I'm out of time, but I'll leave you with
Dr. Kissinger, our satellite time is running out. What wonderful opportunity to conclude our week here with such concrete proposals and ideas of how we can really create, I would say, a new world order.
A world order where everyone shall eat bugs.
Moving on. Now this one is interesting. Rewilding half the planet. Yeah, do you understand what they mean by that? This harkens back to a 2010 document from the Rockefeller Foundation called America in the Next Half Century. In that document, they detail plans to turn the United States into 10 megaregions. They want to federalize all private land and corral people into megacities and sprawling urban centers. So yeah, they have it split up into the Northeast, the Great Lakes, the Piedmont Atlantic. Florida is identified as one by itself, the Gulf Coast, the Arizona Sun Corridor, the Texas Triangle, Cascadia, Northern California, and Southern California. However, in order to do that, they need draconian laws on private land ownership and methods to ensure you're essentially stuck in one particular region. However, maybe you want more proof that they're trying to ban private land ownership. Well, no problem. Check out this quote right here from the Club of Rome. Socially acceptable climate protection measures can also include free access to nature, which may require the communitization of private property. End of quote. Exactly. It's built into their proposals, and it's right out in the open. All you have to do is look. And of course, that will expand as time goes on, because it always does. If more people knew about this kind of stuff, people would revolt and try to shut down this agenda before they even got started. I mean, how insane is that? I mean, really, that is not going to happen here. They'd have to stack up a lot of bodies to get that done. Although, just maybe, their beloved plan of population reduction comes first. It sounds crazy, but again, they want to reduce the population by 75%. That only happens a few different ways, and none of them are good. Up next, we have number 7, clean up the earth. I don't disagree with all of it, such as this, eliminate toxins from the food chain. Well, yeah, that sounds pretty good to me. Instead of going through each point though, I'll just say this. If one of their stated goals is to reduce the population, how much do you trust them? Yeah, not so much, right? But that brings us to infamous number 8. Here we go. Reduce the population by 75%. I mean, what is the current population? About 7.8 billion people or something like that? So to reduce that by 75% would mean they need to dispose of 5.8 billion people, leaving about 2 billion people left on the earth. Dennis Meadows, a founding member of the Club of Rome, believes it needs to be even lower. He claims the earth can only handle 1 billion people.
In one way or another, we are so far, globally, we are so far above the population and the consumption levels which can be supported by this planet that I know in one way or another it's going to come back down. So I don't hope to avoid that. I hope that it can occur in a civil way, and I mean civil in a special way, peaceful. Peace doesn't mean that everybody's happy, but it means that conflict isn't solved through violence, through force, but rather in other ways. And so that's what I hope for. That we can, I mean, the planet can support something like 1 billion people, maybe 2 billion, depending on how much liberty and how much material consumption you want to have. If you want more liberty and more consumption, you have to have fewer people.
You see, even that guy references this voluntary population reduction. And I have a little bit of a hot take for you, alright? You ready? Would you like to know why they push LGBT propaganda around the world? Well, it's simple. Overpopulation. This is their quote-unquote voluntary depopulation plan. Another subsect of them will go even further via gender theory. They'll even sterilize themselves. Now, some people might think I'm crazy for saying this, but you know what I think is even more crazy? Believing that politicians in general care about gay people. They don't care about anybody. And don't forget, they offered abortions and vasectomies at the DNC this year. It's all about population control. It's one big psyop. At least, of course, in my opinion. And also don't forget about the Georgia Guidestones, because they believed that the population should be even lower, at 500 million. I mean, this is too sick to even wrap your head around, to be honest. That's mass murder on a scale that would make all genocidal leaders in the past blush. And they are just openly saying it. I came across a quote from Alan Weissman, a journalist and professor. However, the reason I want to highlight this is because they all have the same exact mindset. And I quote, "Whether we accept it or not, this is likely to be the century that determines what the optimal human population is for our planet. It will come about in one of two ways. Either we decide to manage our own numbers, or nature will do it for us, in the form of famines, thirst, climate chaos, crashing ecosystems, opportunistic disease, and wars over dwindling resources. That would finally cut us down to size," end of quote. Yes, they all believe that. There's so many people in the political sphere that adopted the views of Thomas Malthus regarding population growth, which is exactly why it's called a Malthusian death cult. They view it one of two ways. Either we continue and nature will decide who dies, or they manage the quote-unquote human numbers and they get to decide who dies. Well, they chose to be the managers, determining who has value, determining who gets to live. It's a bit psychotic, don't you think? The real kicker is that their predictions for calamity and death via climate change are similar to a Rorschach test. They see what they want to see. It's their own inner demons manifesting their vision. But you know, as we've talked about many times, they want people to view it as voluntary reduction. However, I will say, when their psyops and propaganda about overpopulation don't get the job done, well, you know what comes next, and it's not going to be voluntary, alright? Let's move on. We're almost done. Yeah, they threw in the pandemic treaty too. That certainly might help manage population numbers and destroy human rights to boot. I'm telling you, every aspect of this agenda has multiple simultaneous attack vectors, multiple failsafes. It's a key reason as to why I view this as something inherently insidious. But what's next? Oh yeah, damn. You know, the Global Technology Conference and a quote-unquote Truth Commission go hand in hand. A Truth Commission. Yeah, let that phrasing marinate for a second. This one hits pretty hard, especially after the UK thought police have taken things to a whole new level. And then of course France arrested the CEO of Telegram because he would not censor people on his platform, just charging him as an accessory to every bad thing that ever happened on his platform. However, do you remember this interview with Klaus Schwab in France? It's in French, so I'll translate, and I quote, "In this new world, we all have to get used to transparency, absolute transparency, no privacy at all, and you have to behave accordingly. If you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear," end of quote. Yeah, they are building a technocratic surveillance state, and this was always the plan. Which is why for years the World Economic Forum has been building their digital coalition for internet safety, which is obviously just a euphemism for mass censorship. It's putting an end to free speech and to the free press. In fact, it goes even further. It's to criminalize speech, criminalize dissent, and to criminalize conversation. Their agenda cannot succeed without mass censorship. These people are true fascists. I mean, really, I'm laughing, but it's not funny. But they are definitely going to have to control information if they want to get rid of 75% of the human race. I mean, if you're planning on doing that, you can't have the masses catch on to what's happening, right? Moving on. Well, look at this. One world currency makes an appearance. And of course, it's a central bank digital currency. Well, that way they can shut off your access to resources, shut off your ability to buy food or whatever product or service they want. It's all going to be tied to individual carbon output and a social credit score, of course. It's a hell of a way to control people, don't you think? This is the main reason why they brag about CBDCs being quote-unquote programmable. You know, what can you even say? This is some of the most evil stuff I've ever heard. Alright, so let's finish up with a video from the president of the Club of Rome. It's a 2-minute clip, but I'm going to interject a few times to break it up.
The second scenario is the giant leap. We wanted to identify a small set of actions, a minimum viable product, to reach as many sustainable development goals in Europe's vision of a social and green region. We wanted to take a systems approach to explore if we can achieve an acceptable level of well-being for the global majority on a finite planet. We conclude that nothing less than the following 5 extraordinary turnarounds are needed to have well-being for all while respecting planetary boundaries. Ending poverty, addressing gross inequality, achieving full gender equity, transforming the food system and the way we eat, transitioning to clean energy and efficient energy. We argue that these 5 extraordinary turnarounds and the set of economic reforms that will drive them form the basis of a well-being economy. It is not a blueprint, but more of a guide for systemic transformation. In this scenario, poverty ends a generation earlier than too little too late. We see gender empowerment in 1 generation, not 10. We see a switch to healthier plant-based diets. There is still meat consumption, but at sustainable levels. And we have carbon dioxide emissions every decade to reach net zero by 2050. The economic model everywhere is circular, regenerative, and efficient.
All right, I gotta stop it right there. First of all, keep in mind the name, Giant Leap. Does it happen to remind you of anything? We're going to talk about that in a second. But then she says the economic model everywhere is circular. Yeah, we're back to getting rid of private ownership.
Material consumption of unsustainable resources is reined in, fossil energy phased out, and we see a significant redistribution of wealth.
So, did you hear that? Yeah, back to plans for economic degrowth and communist visions for redistributing wealth. Perfect.
In this scenario, we introduce a universal basic dividend operating like a universal basic income, with dividends coming to all people, sharing the wealth of the global commons and public goods. Who's taking the wealth now? It is not properly redistributed. This is not utopic. This is what is fair and just and what a society in transformation is all about.
Yes, universal basic income, huh? Well, it's going to be entirely dependent upon compliance and obedience to the government, and your freedoms, luxuries, and access to society could be stripped from you for simply sharing memes on the internet. What a world. You know, it's funny she says it's not utopic. Yeah, we know, it's not. This is a dystopian hellscape for anybody that wants personal agency.
Why do we think this is important? We know the giant leap will be disruptive. We're talking about a complete shakeup. This is everything, everywhere, all at once. It will create shocks. But if it is to succeed, then we must bring the majority of people along the journey.
And I quote, "We know this giant leap will be disruptive. We're talking about a complete shakeup. It will create shocks," end of quote. Yeah, no shit. But this giant leap sort of sounds like Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward, doesn't it? And just so you know, that killed up to 55 million people in arguably the worst famine in human history.
History is truly at a turning point. In times of crisis, the role of governments is more important and more relevant than ever.
The World Economic Forum is actually a critical part of implementing this UN agenda. Some years ago, they became a strategic partner of the UN in the implementation of Agenda 2030. And then you start looking at the connections between the World Economic Forum and China. Klaus Schwab and Xi Jinping, they're like old buddies. They put out press releases about how much they love each other. So you've got the super capitalists represented by the World Economic Forum. And then on the government side, you have communists, right? After Agenda 2030 was adopted, the Communist Party in China put out through all their propaganda organs, they said, we played a critical role in this Agenda 2030. You had Javier Solana, the head of NATO, saying this was going to be the next great leap forward, right? The last great leap forward in China killed millions of people. Why would we want another one of those? That's crazy. So you have communists and super capitalists all coming together and working on this one sustainable development agenda. And that should make us all pause and say, well, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense on the surface. What's going on here?
China is a powerful example of what can be achieved when national governments make environmental protection a top priority.
The motivations of those who are pushing this agenda, many of them tend to emulate countries like China, which have abysmal environmental records. This is a country that has massive pollution problems. They don't seem to care about rivers and lakes and streams. There's all sorts of toxins pouring into them. In actuality, I would say their envy of China is more to do with their control over their population and control over politics than it has to do with the environment. In looking at this, it looks like the environment's a tool to achieve power more than it is an end goal of itself to actually protect nature.
I mean, really, you do not hate these people enough. This great leap forward is in fact a giant leap backward. Wealth redistribution is going to be corrupted, of course. They are going to redistribute the wealth of their citizens directly into their own pockets. Look around you at the current stock of political leaders, both sides in the United States and everybody on the global stage. You'd have to be a lunatic to trust these people with that. They are some of the most corrupt and greedy leaders we've ever had, and that's saying something. On top of that, you will be controlled via surveillance, and they will intentionally hinder your personal growth in order to adhere to this perceived social and planetary boundary. The lies are numerous. First of all, there is no evidence that plant-based diets are healthier, but it goes even further. I mean, I can't even put myself in the headspace of these tyrants. To believe that you have the right to dictate what food we choose to eat or what we spend our money on or how we live in general. These people are sociopaths and should be shunned from society, and I won't be bending to their every whim, I can tell you that. Alright, so be sure to check out the thread and articles from Tim Hinchliffe. Although I thought this was a pretty good, well-rounded view of everything, I also left out a lot, and you can get the full picture by checking his website. A lot of this revolves around their concept of social and planetary boundaries, which is basically just arbitrary limits on how you can live, making sure everybody is capped at a certain level. It's the equality versus equity argument. But keep in mind, manipulating energy costs and driving the world into poverty is just the first step. Then, after that, they can come out with their so-called solutions. As we talked about, create the problem, exploit the problem, and then offer the solution. But again, if you think about it, they are taking different aspects from every totalitarian form of governance in history and just simply slapping them together in order to create a true leviathan of oppression. On the one hand, it's fascistic in the sense that Klaus Schwab's economic plan, stakeholder capitalism, merges government function with corporations. They call it public-private partnerships. Wealth redistribution and depopulation, well, that kind of ties them to Marxism. The surveillance aspect is technocracy. This dystopian photo right here, this is basically their pitch for the future. And to be honest, I don't know what you call this, besides a nightmare. Once again, this is HelioWave. If you like the content, like, comment, and subscribe. Share the video if you want to. If you're in a position to, consider subscribing on Locals, or you could use PayPal. As always, make sure you disobey those true fascistas, and yes, I do hope you have a good night.